By the final years of the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company stood at a height no commercial institution had ever reached before. Yet beneath the polished ledgers and triumphant reports lay a growing unease that few were willing to name. Ships still arrived in Amsterdam heavy with spices, silks, tea, and porcelain, their holds soaked with the smell of pepper and cloves, their sails stiff with salt and thyme. But the rhythm of success had begun to falter in subtle, dangerous ways. Profits were no longer clean or predictable. Orders issued in confidence returned months later, distorted by distance, delay, and defiance. Violence, once a tool used sparingly to establish dominance, had become a permanent condition of rule. The company appeared unassailable, yet it was already straining under the weight of what it had built. At its peak, the VOC was not merely a trading company, but a sovereign force that governed territory, commanded armies, minted coins, negotiated treaties, and waged war across half the globe. From the Cape of Good Hope to the shores of Japan, its flag flew above forts, warehouses, shipyards, and administrative capitals. Tens of thousands of men served it directly, while millions more lived under its authority or suffered its demands. Shareholders in the Dutch Republic spoke of the company with pride and confidence, convinced that its system of monopolized trade and disciplined administration had created a machine that could not fail. Yet the very scale that inspired awe had begun to erode control, and the signs of fracture were visible to those living far from the counting houses of Europe. In Batavia, the company's Asian headquarters, the day began before sunrise, when clerks gathered in humid offices to copy orders that would not be answered for half a year. Governors ruled with near absolute authority, their decisions shaped as much by fear and ambition as by instruction from Amsterdam. Soldiers drilled in the heat, many weakened by disease long before they ever faced an enemy. Sailors waited in crowded harbors, uncertain whether the next voyage would bring profit, punishment, or death. Local populations, once courted as partners in trade, now lived under constant surveillance, their harvests regulated, their movements restricted, their loyalty enforced through threat and example. The company's presence was everywhere, and yet its grip was growing uneven. This imbalance did not emerge suddenly. It was the product of a system designed for expansion, but ill-suited for permanence. The VOC had been created to dominate trade routes, seize strategic ports, and exclude rivals through force where negotiation failed. Speed and aggression were its strengths in the early decades, when Portuguese and local powers could be overwhelmed and displaced. Success bred confidence, and confidence hardened into policy. Forts multiplied, fleets expanded, and monopolies were enforced with increasing severity. Every gain required protection, every protection required manpower, and every man sent overseas represented a cost that could not easily be recovered. The company grew outward faster than it could consolidate inward. For those at sea, the cracks were felt long before they were acknowledged in reports. Voyages stretched longer as ships were diverted to enforce blockades or suppress resistance. Supplies ran thin, discipline grew harsher, and mortality climbed steadily. Men signed on out of desperation or debt, not loyalty, and many never returned. The company replaced them easily enough, but replacement carried its own cost. Training suffered, experience was lost, and the sense of shared purpose that had once driven crews across oceans began to erode. What remained was obedience enforced by punishment rather than belief. In the Dutch Republic, the directors of the company, the Heren 17th, continued to issue directives with confidence, relying on figures that concealed as much as they revealed. Profits were calculated over vast distances and long intervals, smoothing over losses and disguising inefficiencies. Dividends were paid not only from revenue, but increasingly from borrowed money, sustaining the appearance of prosperity while debt accumulated quietly beneath the surface. The company's reputation remained strong, but its financial foundation was becoming less stable with each passing year. The monopoly itself, once the source of extraordinary wealth, had begun to demand more than it returned. Maintaining exclusive control over spices required constant enforcement. Crops had to be destroyed when grown outside approved zones. Smugglers had to be hunted. Local rulers had to be coerced or replaced. Each act of enforcement generated resistance, and each act of resistance demanded further force. Violence ceased to be a temporary measure and became the everyday language of governance. The company ruled not through consent, but through exhaustion and fear, a strategy that could suppress rebellion but not eliminate it. These pressures converged most sharply in the company's administrative centers, where authority was absolute, but accountability was distant. Governors enriched themselves through private trade, bribery, and manipulation of supply chains, confident that oversight from Europe would be slow, fragmented, and easily deceived. Corruption did not exist at the margins. It embedded itself into routine operations. Honest officials found themselves isolated or complicit, while dishonest ones prospered. The system rewarded those who could extract wealth quickly and punished those who sought long-term stability. Still, the outward image of the VOC remained intact. Its ships dominated key sea lanes, its forts stood firm, and its name carried weight in negotiations across Asia. To rivals, it appeared formidable. To investors, it seemed indispensable. To many within its ranks, however, the company was becoming an environment of constant strain, where orders conflicted, resources were scarce, and survival depended less on policy than on improvisation. The gap between appearance and reality widened steadily, sustained only by distance and delay. The danger lay not in a single enemy or a sudden catastrophe, but in the accumulation of unresolved pressures. Each decision made to preserve control created new obligations. Each obligation drained resources. Each drain required further expansion or enforcement to justify itself. The company moved forward because it could not afford to stop, even as the cost of movement increased. What had once been a vehicle for profit was becoming a structure that consumed its own foundations to remain upright. By the turn of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company had achieved what no corporation before it had managed. Yet it had also locked itself into a path that allowed little room for correction. Its power was vast, but it was brittle. Its authority extended across oceans, but its ability to govern coherently diminished with every mile. The collapse that would one day define its legacy did not begin with failure or defeat. It began here, at the height of success, when expansion masked fragility and confidence silenced warning. As the company pressed onward, enforcing monopolies, suppressing resistance, and promising returns it struggled to deliver, the conditions for survival grew harsher for everyone within its reach. The next stage would not be marked by triumph, but by strain, as distance and delay transformed authority into something unstable and dangerous. The machinery that had built an empire now demanded constant motion to avoid breaking apart, and the first signs of that break were already visible to those forced to live inside it. The danger that followed the Dutch East India Company into the 18th century did not arrive with cannon fire or open rebellion, but with silence, measured in months and oceans. Orders left Amsterdam sealed in wax and certainty, carried aboard ships that would not reach Asia for half a year if they arrived at all. By the time those orders were read in Batavia, conditions had already changed, alliances had shifted, markets had moved, and violence had altered the ground on which decisions were meant to operate. Authority existed, but it traveled too slowly to control the world it claimed to rule. For the men who governed in Asia, Distance was not an abstraction, but a daily reality that shaped every action. Governors general and councillors acted knowing that oversight was distant and delayed, and that the consequences of their decisions would be judged long after the damage or profit had already been secured. A brutal suppression carried out today would be explained months later as necessity. A private fortune extracted through corruption would be hidden behind carefully prepared accounts before any inquiry could begin. The system did not encourage restraint. It rewarded decisiveness, speed, and results, regardless of cost. This separation between command and consequence reshaped how power was exercised. In theory, Batavia was subordinate to Amsterdam, bound by instructions and regulations designed to maintain order and profitability. In practice, the company's Asian administration functioned as a semi-independent state, forced to respond to threats and opportunities without timely guidance. Local wars, shifting trade routes, outbreaks of disease, and sudden shortages demanded immediate action. Governors learned quickly that survival depended less on compliance with distant rules than on maintaining authority on the ground. For sailors, soldiers, and laborers, the consequences of this system were felt in their bodies. Voyages grew longer as ships were rerouted to enforce monopolies or supply isolated forts. Disease spread rapidly through cramped quarters, unchecked by medical knowledge or adequate provisions. Men died in numbers that were accepted as routine losses, recorded in ledgers as figures rather than lives. Replacement crews were recruited from Europe's poorest communities, men already weakened by hunger and debt before they ever reached the sea. The company required bodies in constant supply, and the distance between recruitment and death made that demand easier to sustain. Communication delays also fractured responsibility. When disasters occurred, blame dissolved into geography. A failed expedition could be attributed to local incompetence. A massacre could be justified as an unavoidable response to resistance. A collapsing trade network could be explained as temporary disruption. By the time information reached Europe, the moment for intervention had passed. Decisions were judged after the fact, stripped of urgency, and often resolved with little more than formal reprimands or quiet reassignment. The structure of the VOC amplified this problem. Authority in Asia was concentrated in a small number of officials who commanded vast territories with limited supervision. These men controlled not only military forces, but trade, justice, and diplomacy. Their power was reinforced by isolation, surrounded by subordinates, dependent on their favor, and local populations subjected to their rule. In such an environment, loyalty flowed upward, not outward, and fear replaced accountability. The company's interests blurred with personal ambition, and the line between official policy and private enterprise grew increasingly thin. Distance also distorted economic reality. Prices set in Europe failed to reflect conditions in Asia. Crops were destroyed to maintain monopolies, even as local shortages worsened. Warehouses filled with goods that could not be sold at expected prices, while enforcement costs continued to rise. Decisions meant to protect profits often undermined them, but the delay in reporting masked these failures. By the time losses were acknowledged, new strategies had already been implemented, compounding the damage. The human cost of this system extended beyond company employees. Local communities lived under rules imposed by absent authorities, enforced by men who acted with wide discretion. Treaties were signed under pressure and broken when convenient. Harvests were seized or destroyed without warning. Resistance was met with punishment designed to deter future defiance, often indiscriminately applied. The company relied on fear to compensate for its inability to govern closely, a strategy that demanded continual escalation. In Batavia, the effects of distance manifested as paranoia and severity. Governors knew that their authority rested on the perception of control. Any sign of weakness risked rebellion, desertion, or loss of prestige. As a result, punishments became harsher, surveillance more constant, and tolerance for dissent non-existent. Executions were public and deliberate, intended to remind all who watched that power was present even if oversight was not. The city functioned as the nerve center of the company's Asian empire, but its atmosphere was one of strain rather than confidence. Meanwhile, in Amsterdam, confidence persisted. The company's directors debated policy based on reports that smoothed over crises and emphasized continuity. The long delay between action and review encouraged optimism, allowing problems to be reframed as temporary disruptions rather than structural flaws. Investors saw dividends continue to flow and assumed stability. The machinery of distance insulated decision-makers from the reality of conditions overseas, reinforcing a belief that the system remained sound. This gap between perception and reality widened steadily. Each year of delayed communication allowed further divergence between intention and outcome. Officials in Asia adapted the company's policies to local circumstances, often in ways that prioritized immediate survival over long-term sustainability. What emerged was not a single coherent strategy, but a patchwork of responses shaped by fear, opportunity, and personal gain. The VOC became less a unified entity than a collection of semi-autonomous regimes bound loosely by shared branding and financial obligation. The cost of this fragmentation was borne quietly at first. Profits declined unevenly, masked by occasional windfalls. Discipline eroded among crews who no longer trusted that service would be rewarded. Local partners withdrew cooperation, calculating that the company's threats were less reliable than before. Each small failure reinforced the need for harsher measures, and each harsh measure generated new resistance. Distance did not merely slow communication, it transformed governance into something reactive and brittle. By the early 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was trapped within the structure that had once enabled its rise. It could not shorten the oceans that separated its centers of power, nor could it easily relinquish control without admitting weakness. Every solution available to it required more force, more expenditure, and more delegation to officials who operated beyond effective supervision. The system persisted not because it functioned well, but because it had no mechanism for retreat. The danger ahead did not lie in a single decision or battle, but in the accumulation of choices made under these conditions. Distance encouraged autonomy encouraged corruption, and corruption undermined cohesion. The company continued to act as though authority flowed smoothly from Amsterdam to Asia, even as that flow became increasingly distorted. What followed would not be sudden collapse, but gradual erosion, as the cost of ruling from afar began to outweigh the profits of doing so. As the company pushed deeper into this imbalance, enforcing monopolies and expanding obligations without restoring control, new pressures began to emerge. The monopoly itself, once the engine of wealth, demanded ever greater effort to sustain. Violence, already routine, would soon become inseparable from survival. The next phase would reveal how holding exclusive power over trade could turn from advantage to liability, drawing the company into conflicts it could no longer manage from a distance. The danger that now pressed against the Dutch East India Company did not come from sudden invasion or open revolt, but from the quiet, grinding expense of maintaining absolute control. The monopoly that had once transformed scattered trading ventures into an empire now demanded constant attention, constant enforcement, and constant violence. What had begun as a strategy to exclude rivals had hardened into a permanent condition of rule, one that consumed men, money, and authority at a rate that profits could no longer reliably replace. In theory, the monopoly was simple. Spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and mace would be grown only in approved territories, sold only to the company, transported only in company ships, and distributed at prices set in Europe. In practice, this system required an unbroken chain of compliance stretching across thousands of islands and countless communities. Every farmer who planted beyond approved zones threatened the balance. Every merchant who traded outside company channels weakened control. Every rival ship that slipped through patrols undermined prices. Monopoly was not self-sustaining. It had to be imposed again and again. For those living in the spice-producing regions, the monopoly was experienced not as policy, but as intrusion. Fields that had once supported local trade networks were now subject to inspection and destruction. Crops were uprooted or burned to prevent unauthorized sale. Villages were forced to deliver fixed quantities regardless of weather, soil exhaustion, or population loss. The rhythms of local life bent under external demands, enforced by soldiers who neither spoke the language nor shared the consequences of failure. Compliance was extracted through fear, not cooperation, and fear required continual reinforcement. This enforcement carried a cost that grew heavier each year. Patrol fleets had to be maintained to hunt smugglers across wide seas. Forts had to be garrisoned on islands that produced little profit beyond their strategic value. Soldiers had to be paid, fed, and replaced as disease and desertion thinned their ranks. Ships diverted to policing duties were ships not carrying goods to market. Each measure, taken to preserve exclusivity, reduced the company's flexibility and increased its expenses. Rival powers understood these weaknesses and exploited them whenever possible. English, French, and Asian traders tested the edges of company control, trading quietly where patrols were thin or forging alliances with local rulers resentful of Dutch dominance. Suppressing these challenges required force, diplomacy, and bribery, often all at once. Victories were temporary, smuggling routes shifted rather than disappeared, and each suppression campaign spread resentment that made future enforcement more difficult. Within the company, the monopoly reshaped incentives in dangerous ways. Officials responsible for enforcement discovered that private trade offered faster and safer profit than loyalty to company regulations. A governor who tolerated smuggling in exchange for bribes could enrich himself while still reporting acceptable figures to Batavia. A ship's captain who concealed cargo could secure a fortune beyond his official pay. The monopoly created opportunities for corruption precisely because it was so difficult to enforce completely. This internal leakage compounded external pressure. As more goods bypassed official channels, revenues declined unevenly, making losses harder to trace. Directors in Amsterdam received reports that emphasized continued control while masking the scale of private trade. Enforcement intensified, not because it worked, but because failure demanded a visible response. Each new regulation added complexity to a system already strained by distance and delay. The human toll of this cycle fell hardest on those least able to resist. Sailors were ordered into dangerous patrols against lightly armed smugglers who knew the waters better than they did. Soldiers were stationed on remote islands where disease claimed more lives than combat. Local populations endured collective punishment for violations committed by individuals, their livelihoods disrupted to maintain prices set far away. The monopoly did not discriminate between willing partners and coerced subjects. All were reduced to components in a system designed to serve distant markets. In Batavia, administrators struggled to balance competing demands. They were expected to deliver profits, suppress resistance, and maintain order, all with limited resources and unreliable information. Failure in any area invited scrutiny from Amsterdam, yet success in enforcement often deepened hostility among local communities and neighboring powers. Governors learned that visible displays of strength were safer than restraint, even when strength achieved little beyond temporary compliance. Violence became a language understood by all, even as it undermined the company's long-term position. The monopoly also distorted strategic priorities. Regions that produced high-value spices received disproportionate attention, while other areas were neglected or exploited without investment. This imbalance left trade networks fragile, dependent on a narrow range of commodities whose prices fluctuated with global demand. When markets shifted or harvests failed, the company lacked alternatives. Diversification, which might have reduced risk, was sacrificed to preserve exclusivity, binding the company's fortunes ever tighter to the success of enforcement. As costs rose, the logic of monopoly began to invert. Instead of generating wealth through controlled trade, the system demanded increasing expenditure simply to prevent loss. The company was no longer expanding because opportunity beckoned, but because retreat threatened collapse. Each concession encouraged rivals. Each reduction in force invited defiance. The monopoly could be maintained only through continuous escalation, yet escalation yielded diminishing returns. For those inside the company, the strain was evident. Orders conflicted as officials tried to reconcile profit targets with security demands. Morale eroded among crews tasked with endless policing rather than commerce. Local allies became scarce, replaced by informants motivated by fear or payment rather than loyalty. Trust, once a foundation of trade, vanished from the company's relationships, replaced by contracts enforced at gunpoint. By the early decades of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company had bound itself to a system that could not easily adapt. Monopoly, once the source of dominance, had become a liability that required constant sacrifice. The company's authority rested increasingly on its ability to inflict harm rather than to offer advantage, a position that demanded resources faster than trade could replenish them. The pressure to maintain exclusivity would soon reshape company policy in darker ways. Violence, already routine, would be formalized as doctrine. Entire communities would be treated not as partners or subjects, but as obstacles to be removed. The monopoly could survive only if resistance was extinguished completely, and that conviction would push the company toward actions that deepened its isolation and accelerated its decline. The moment violence ceased to be a response and became a routine marked a turning point the Dutch East India Company could not reverse. What had once been justified as necessary enforcement hardened into doctrine, shaping how the company governed, traded, and survived. By the early 18th century, force was no longer deployed to restore order after disruption. It was embedded into daily administration, assumed as the most reliable instrument of control in a world the company no longer trusted to cooperate. This transformation was not announced or debated openly. It emerged through repetition. Each successful act of intimidation reinforced the belief that fear was effective. Each suppressed rebellion confirmed that restraint invited challenge. Over time, policy followed practice, and practice followed precedent. Entire regions were governed under the assumption that compliance would not be offered voluntarily, and that negotiation signaled weakness. Violence became predictable, even procedural, applied according to patterns that stripped it of moral urgency and replaced it with bureaucratic efficiency. For local populations, this shift was unmistakable. The company no longer needed a specific provocation to act. Suspicion alone justified punishment. Villages could be destroyed to deter potential resistance rather than to respond to it. Leaders were executed not for crimes committed, but for influence they might one day wield against company interests. The line between security and terror blurred until it ceased to exist. Order was maintained not by shared benefit, but by the memory of what happened to those who resisted. Within the company's ranks, violence reshaped identity and expectation. Soldiers were trained less as defenders than as enforcers, tasked with carrying out actions designed to leave lasting impressions rather than decisive victories. Discipline grew harsher, reflecting the logic imposed on the populations they controlled. Executions, floggings, and imprisonment were public and deliberate, intended to assert authority as much internally as externally. Fear flowed downward through the hierarchy, binding obedience through shared vulnerability rather than loyalty. Administrators in Batavia came to rely on this system because it simplified decision-making. Complex negotiations required time, cultural understanding, and trust, all of which were scarce commodities in a structure stretched thin by distance and delay. Violence offered immediacy. It produced visible results that could be reported as success. A destroyed settlement required no further management. A silenced leader left no correspondence to interpret. The costs, human and material, were real, but they were deferred, dispersed, and often borne by those without a voice in company records. This reliance on force also altered how the company perceived the world around it. Local societies were no longer seen as dynamic communities with interests and alliances, but as potential threats to be neutralized. Allies were tolerated only so long as they remained useful and obedient. Once usefulness declined, coercion replaced cooperation. This approach narrowed the company's understanding of its environment, leaving it blind to shifts that could not be measured through obedience alone. The precedent for this system had been established decades earlier, but its normalization marked a deeper collapse of restraint. Violence was now applied not only in frontier zones, but within established centers of control. In Batavia itself, fear governed daily life. The city's diverse population lived under constant surveillance, aware that accusations could lead to imprisonment or worse. Authority was absolute, and mercy unpredictable. This atmosphere did not produce stability. It produced silence, and silence concealed resentment rather than eliminating it. For company officials, the normalization of violence created a dangerous illusion of control. Each act of repression seemed to confirm the company's dominance, even as it eroded the foundations of cooperation necessary for sustainable trade. Merchants withdrew into secrecy. Information became unreliable as fear distorted reporting. Local intermediaries, once essential to navigating complex networks, either fled or complied minimally, offering obedience without commitment. The company mistook the absence of open resistance for loyalty, unaware that its power now depended on constant vigilance. The financial implications of this approach were severe. Maintaining a regime of fear required permanent readiness. Troops had to be stationed indefinitely. Fortifications had to be repaired and expanded. Ships were diverted from trade to patrol and punishment. Each measure increased costs while reducing revenue-generating activity. Violence did not create wealth. It consumed it, even as it became indispensable to preserving the monopoly. Corruption thrived under these conditions. Officials who controlled force also controlled opportunity. By threatening punishment or offering protection, they extracted wealth from both local populations and company resources. Violence shielded these practices by discouraging complaints and distorting records. Those who benefited from the system had little incentive to question it, while those harmed lacked the means to challenge it. The company's moral authority eroded alongside its financial integrity, though neither was openly acknowledged. For sailors and soldiers, the human cost intensified. Assignments increasingly involved punitive expeditions rather than commerce or defense. Exposure to brutality became routine, numbing and demoralizing those tasked with carrying it out. Desertion increased as men sought escape from a service that offered danger without purpose and discipline without reward. The company responded by tightening control, deepening the cycle of coercion that now defined its operations. This policy of violence also reshaped the company's reputation beyond its immediate territories. Rivals observed not a confident trading power, but a regime struggling to maintain control through intimidation. Local rulers calculated alliances accordingly, weighing the benefits of cooperation against the certainty of future coercion. Resistance did not vanish. It adapted, becoming quieter, more patient, and more widespread. The company faced opposition not as isolated revolts, but as an environment increasingly hostile to its presence. By embedding violence into governance, the Dutch East India Company forfeited alternatives. It could no longer easily negotiate without appearing inconsistent. It could not reduce its military footprint without risking collapse. Every decision became constrained by the need to maintain fear, a resource that diminished with overuse. The company's authority now rested on an unstable foundation, requiring constant reinforcement simply to stand still. As this system hardened, the company moved further from the conditions that had once enabled its success. Trade thrived on trust, predictability, and mutual advantage, all of which violence undermined. The VOC had chosen a path that preserved control in the short term at the expense of adaptability and legitimacy. What followed would be an internal reckoning, as the normalization of brutality began to corrode the company from within, turning its own administration into another site of collapse. The collapse of restraint within the Dutch East India Company did not end with violence imposed on others. It turned inward, reshaping the company's own administration until corruption was no longer a deviation but an expected outcome of service. By the early 18th century, dishonesty was not an occasional abuse of power to be corrected. It was a structural feature that sustained the machinery of rule in a world governed by fear, distance, and opportunity. This transformation occurred quietly, without formal acknowledgement, because it aligned too well with the conditions the company had created. Officials in Asia operated far from effective supervision, armed with broad authority and protected by the slow movement of information. They controlled trade routes, tax collection, military force, and judicial power, often simultaneously. In such an environment, the distinction between company interest and personal enrichment blurred until it became irrelevant. Power invited extraction, and extraction became routine. For a governor or senior official, private trade offered rewards that official salaries could never match. Cargo space could be diverted without immediate detection. Contracts could be awarded in exchange for payment. Enforcement could be relaxed for those who paid for leniency. Each act of corruption could be explained away as pragmatism, justified by the difficulty of maintaining order and profit under hostile conditions. The system rewarded those who took advantage of it and marginalized those who did not. The company's monopoly intensified this dynamic. Because trade outside official channels was forbidden, any private exchange automatically became illegal, granting enormous leverage to those tasked with enforcement. Officials could threaten punishment or offer protection at will, transforming regulation into a tool for extortion. Smuggling did not undermine the system from outside. It became integrated into it, tolerated and taxed unofficially by those in power. The company lost revenue not because trade vanished, but because it flowed into private hands. At the lower levels, clerks manipulated accounts, sailors concealed cargo, and warehouse managers falsified inventories. Each small act seemed insignificant in isolation, but together they eroded the integrity of the company's finances. Losses were hidden within the complexity of long-distance trade, where delays and hazards provided convenient explanations. When discrepancies emerged, blame was assigned to storms, piracy, or local resistance rather than systemic theft. Accountability dissolved into plausible deniability. Batavia, the administrative heart of the VOC's Asian empire, reflected this decay with unsettling clarity. The city's institutions functioned, but their purpose had shifted. Courts enforced company authority selectively, often favoring those with connections or resources. Military units were deployed not only against external threats, but to protect private interests aligned with officials. governance became transactional, its legitimacy dependent on who could pay or intimidate most effectively. The company's own capital operated under the same logic it imposed on conquered territories. The culture of corruption also reshaped relationships within the company. Loyalty was measured not by adherence to policy, but by participation in shared networks of profit. Those who refused to engage in private trade found themselves isolated, reassigned, or accused of incompetence. Advancement favored those willing to exploit their positions quickly, knowing that tenure was uncertain and oversight distant. This environment discouraged long-term planning and encouraged extraction at every opportunity. For sailors and soldiers, corruption translated into neglect. Supplies were skimmed or sold, leaving crews underfed and poorly equipped. Pay was delayed or reduced through manipulation, increasing resentment and desertion. Discipline was enforced harshly to suppress complaints rather than address grievances. The company relied on coercion to maintain order among its own workforce, mirroring the methods it used to govern subject populations. In Europe, the directors of the company struggled to understand the scale of the problem. Reports arrived filtered through layers of interested parties, each with reason to conceal wrongdoing. Investigations were rare and often inconclusive, hampered by distance and conflicting testimony. When corruption was acknowledged, it was framed as the failure of individuals rather than the consequence of policy. Punishments, when imposed, were selective and symbolic, intended to reassure investors without disrupting operations. The financial consequences accumulated steadily. Revenue declined as private trade siphoned off profits. Costs increased as inefficiencies multiplied and enforcement expanded. To maintain dividends, the company borrowed, disguising weakness with credit. This strategy depended on confidence, both within the Republic and among foreign partners, and confidence depended on the illusion that the system remained under control. Corruption thus became essential to preserving appearances, even as it hollowed out the company's core. Local populations experienced this decay as unpredictability. Rules changed according to who enforced them. Obligations could be avoided through payment, but protection was never guaranteed. The company's authority appeared arbitrary, its justice inconsistent. Resentment deepened, not only toward the Dutch, but toward the idea of rule itself. Cooperation gave way to calculation, as communities weighed the risks of compliance against the certainty of exploitation. By this stage, the Dutch East India Company no longer functioned as a unified institution pursuing collective goals. It had become a framework within which individuals pursued personal survival and enrichment, constrained loosely by regulations that could be bent or ignored. The mechanisms designed to ensure order now facilitated disorder, while the appearance of strength concealed an erosion of trust that no amount of force could restore. As corruption embedded itself into daily operations, the company's ability to respond to crisis weakened. Decisions were shaped by private interest rather than strategic necessity. Resources were diverted from essential functions. Information became unreliable, distorted by those who feared exposure. The VOC could still command obedience, but it could no longer rely on coherence. This internal decay set the stage for the next phase of collapse. The company's administrative heart, already strained by violence and distance, would soon face pressures it could not conceal or suppress. Disease, fear, and paranoia would converge in its capital, turning Batavia into a symbol not of imperial confidence, but of systemic breakdown. The danger that now defined the Dutch East India Company gathered most visibly in Batavia, the city meant to embody order, authority, and permanence in Asia. What had been founded as a secure administrative center became a place where fear, disease, and suspicion shaped daily life, reflecting the deeper failures of the system it governed. Batavia was not collapsing in chaos. It was functioning precisely as designed, and that design was destroying it from within. The city's streets bore the marks of ambition turned brittle. Canals cut through dense neighborhoods, intended to mirror those of the Dutch Republic, but stagnant water bred illness rather than stability. Warehouses overflowed at times with goods that could not be moved efficiently, while shortages plagued garrisons and crews. Fortifications loomed over crowded quarters where soldiers, laborers, enslaved people, and merchants lived under constant scrutiny. The physical layout of Batavia reinforced separation and control, yet it also trapped the city in conditions that made health and trust impossible to sustain. Disease was an ever-present threat, claiming lives without regard for rank or loyalty. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly in the tropical climate, exacerbated by poor sanitation and overcrowding. Officials and laborers alike succumbed, often within months of arrival. Mortality rates were accepted as an unavoidable cost of doing business, and replacements were shipped in from Europe or recruited locally, with little concern for continuity. Experience drained away as quickly as it was acquired, leaving administration unstable and dependent on men unfamiliar with local conditions. Fear governed the city's political life as thoroughly as disease governed its physical one. Authority was centralized in the governor-general and council, whose power depended on the perception of absolute control. Any challenge, real or imagined, was treated as a threat to the entire system. Surveillance extended into private spaces, and accusations carried weight regardless of evidence. The legal apparatus existed not to balance justice, but to reinforce obedience, its outcomes shaped by political necessity rather than consistency. Executions and punishments were public and deliberate, staged to remind the population of the consequences of disloyalty. Soldiers and civilians alike were subject to harsh discipline, and mercy was rare. This atmosphere discouraged dissent, but also suppressed honest reporting. Officials learned to conceal problems rather than risk being associated with failure. Bad news became dangerous, and silence became a survival strategy. The city functioned, but it did so through repression rather than confidence. The administrative culture of Batavia mirrored the corruption entrenched throughout the company. Offices became sites of negotiation and extraction. Decisions were influenced by personal alliances and private interests, with official policy serving as a flexible framework rather than a binding guide. Records were manipulated to satisfy expectations from Europe while masking local realities. The city's role as an intermediary between Amsterdam and Asia magnified these distortions, as information passed through multiple hands before reaching its destination. For the soldiers stationed in Batavia, service was marked by monotony, illness, and fear. Drill and punishment structured their days, reinforcing discipline in an environment where morale was fragile. Desertion was common, and trust between ranks eroded as informants were encouraged to report discontent. The company relied on coercion to maintain order within its own garrison, reflecting its broader reliance on force as governance. Local populations experienced Batavia as a place of constraint rather than opportunity. Movement was regulated, labor extracted, and loyalty demanded without reciprocal security. Cultural and economic life persisted, but always under the shadow of authority. The city did not integrate its diverse inhabitants into a shared community. It segmented them into categories of usefulness and risk. This fragmentation weakened social bonds and increased dependence on enforcement. Despite these conditions, Batavia remained indispensable to the company. It coordinated trade, administered justice, and projected power across the region. Its very existence reinforced the illusion that the VOC's empire was coherent and controllable. Yet this centralization also meant that failures within Batavia resonated outward. Decisions distorted by fear and corruption affected distant territories, multiplying errors rather than correcting them. The financial burden of maintaining the city grew heavier each year. Fortifications required constant repair. Garrison costs rose as turnover increased. Administrative inefficiencies drained resources that could have supported trade. Batavia consumed wealth without generating proportional returns, a liability masked by its symbolic importance. The company could not abandon its capital without admitting weakness, yet maintaining it demanded increasing sacrifice. The psychological toll on those who governed was evident. Governors ruled under constant pressure, aware that failure could lead to disgrace or worse. This insecurity encouraged short-term thinking and aggressive posturing, reinforcing the cycle of violence and corruption. Decisions prioritized immediate control over long-term stability, further entrenching the city's role as a site of decay rather than renewal. By the early 18th century, Batavia stood as a concentrated expression of the Dutch East India Company's contradictions. It was powerful yet fragile, orderly yet corrupt, central yet disconnected from the realities it governed. The city did not merely reflect the company's problems, it amplified them, transmitting fear and dysfunction across its networks. As Batavia struggled to maintain authority, the human foundation of the company began to weaken more visibly. The men who sailed its ships and manned its forts no longer believed in the system that commanded them. Exhaustion, resentment, and loss of purpose spread through the ranks, threatening the very mechanisms that sustained the company's reach. The next phase of collapse would unfold not in boardrooms or capitals, but among the sailors and soldiers whose faith in the enterprise was finally breaking. The first true signs of collapse within the Dutch East India Company appeared not in ledgers or treaties, but among the men who moved its empire across the sea. Long before investors questioned dividends or directors debated reform, sailors and soldiers began to withdraw something the company could not replace easily: belief. Without faith in the purpose or promise of service, the machinery that sustained trade and control began to grind unevenly, driven by coercion rather than commitment. For the ordinary sailor, service in the VOC had once offered the possibility of advancement, steady pay, and a share in the wealth flowing from Asia. By the early 18th century, that promise had eroded. Voyages were longer, conditions harsher, and returns uncertain. Men signed on not out of expectation but necessity, driven by debt, poverty, or conscription. The company no longer recruited loyalty. It harvested desperation, filling its ships with crews already resigned to suffering. Life at sea reflected the company's priorities with brutal clarity. Space was maximized for cargo, not comfort. Provisions were rationed tightly, often spoiled before the halfway point of the journey. Disease spread quickly in cramped quarters, and mortality was accepted as inevitable. Officers enforced discipline through punishment rather than leadership, mirroring the methods used throughout the company's territories. Obedience was demanded, but respect was absent. The structure of command further undermined morale. Promotions were influenced less by competence than by connections and participation in private trade networks. Skilled sailors watched inexperienced or corrupt officers advance, reinforcing the belief that service offered little reward beyond survival. Pay was frequently delayed or reduced through manipulation, leaving families in Europe without support and fueling resentment among crews who risked their lives for diminishing compensation. Once in Asia, the situation rarely improved. Ships were diverted from commerce to patrol and enforcement duties, exposing crews to danger without the prospect of profit. Soldiers were dispatched on punitive expeditions that offered no clear objective beyond intimidation. These assignments eroded any remaining sense of purpose, replacing it with exhaustion and disillusionment. Men began to see themselves not as participants in a great enterprise, but as expendable instruments of control. Desertion became increasingly common. Sailors slipped away in ports where opportunity seemed preferable to continued service. Soldiers abandoned posts rather than endure disease and brutality. The company responded with harsher penalties, including execution, believing fear could compensate for lost loyalty. These measures suppressed open defiance but deepened alienation, reinforcing the perception that the company valued obedience over human life. Mutiny, though rare, loomed as a constant threat. Crews pushed to their limits weighed the risks of rebellion against the certainty of continued suffering. Even when mutiny did not occur, passive resistance emerged. Work slowed, orders were followed minimally, initiative disappeared. Ships arrived late, poorly maintained and undermanned, increasing losses and compounding delays. The company's reliance on coercion produced compliance without competence. For soldiers stationed in forts and garrisons, conditions mirrored those at sea. Isolated, undersupplied, and exposed to disease, they enforced policies that made them targets of local resentment. Their role as enforcers of monopolies and punishments placed them in constant danger, yet recognition and reward were scarce. Many saw their service as a sentence rather than a calling, counting the days until death, escape, or discharge. The erosion of belief had operational consequences that rippled outward. Trade schedules became unreliable as crews failed to perform at expected levels. Maintenance suffered as men lacked motivation to preserve ships that symbolized exploitation rather than opportunity. Information flow deteriorated as sailors and soldiers withheld details or exaggerated losses to avoid blame. The company's ability to respond to crises weakened as its human infrastructure faltered. Local populations noticed these changes. The once feared presence of company forces became uneven, their authority undermined by visible fatigue and disunity. Resistance adapted accordingly, testing boundaries and exploiting lapses in enforcement. The company responded by tightening discipline, further alienating its workforce and accelerating decline. Fear could compel action, but it could not restore confidence or initiative. In Europe, these developments remained largely invisible. Reports focused on material outcomes rather than human conditions. Losses were attributed to external factors rather than internal decay. The men who sustained the empire were reduced to numbers, their suffering absorbed into the cost of doing business. This abstraction allowed the system to persist even as its foundations weakened. By the time the directors sensed that something was wrong, the damage was already embedded. The company's reach depended on men willing to endure hardship for uncertain reward. As belief faded, the VOC lost not only labor, but adaptability. It could still command, but it could no longer inspire. The difference mattered more than any single battle or treaty. As faith eroded among those who sailed and fought, the company's reliance on force increased further. Maintaining control required more troops, more ships, and more punishment, all supplied by a workforce that no longer trusted the institution it served. The cycle tightened, drawing the company into conflicts that consumed resources faster than trade could replace them. The next stage would reveal how endless warfare, born from this imbalance, began to overwhelm even the appearance of stability. By the early 18th century, the Dutch East India Company had entrenched itself across vast territories, yet its dominion was sustained less by commerce than by the perpetual presence of armed force. Fleets patrolled the sea lanes, garrisons held strategic islands, and forts bristled with cannon, not only to defend holdings, but to impose monopolies and suppress resistance. What had begun as a system of selective coercion had transformed into an endless cycle of warfare, each engagement demanding men, money, and material at a pace the company could scarcely sustain. Conflicts with foreign powers were frequent and unavoidable. The English, the French, and the Portuguese tested the edges of Dutch influence, sometimes overtly, sometimes through quiet encroachment on trade routes. Each challenge required response. Ships were diverted from profitable voyages to intercept rivals. Fortifications were reinforced or rebuilt. Soldiers were dispatched to patrol contested territories. Even temporary success came at tremendous cost, measured not only in coin, but in manpower. The company could seize control in a skirmish, but could not easily consolidate it, leaving forces stretched thin across a web of dependencies. Local rulers, too, resisted in ways both subtle and violent. Alliances were fragile, treaties often disregarded, and populations were quick to exploit gaps in enforcement. Entire villages might disappear from company records for failing to supply required spices, only to reappear months later under new leadership or in rebellion. Suppressing such insubordination demanded punitive expeditions, whose expenses were compounded by disease, attrition, and the difficulty of transporting men and supplies across vast distances. Each victory secured obedience temporarily, but planted the seeds of future resistance. The human toll was immense. Soldiers faced long campaigns in hostile climates, suffering from tropical fevers, starvation, and exhaustion. Sailors endured prolonged voyages, exposed to storms, disease, and the threat of ambush. Mortality among crews and garrisons was treated as an acceptable cost of maintaining control. Replacement was possible but expensive. An experience lost to death or desertion could not easily be recovered. The company's empire expanded on maps, but the lives sustaining it were depleted in numbers and morale. War also dictated economic priorities, often in ways that undermined profit. Ships that might carry spices to Europe were diverted for patrols or assaults. Forts required ongoing maintenance rather than producing revenue. Armaments and provisions had to be replenished continuously, draining the company's reserves. Even when trade succeeded, the margin was eroded by the infrastructure needed to enforce it. Monopoly depended on force, yet force consumed the very resources it was meant to protect. Internal pressures compounded the problem. Commanders had discretion over garrisons and fleets, and many exploited it for personal enrichment. Corruption and private trading persisted even amid conflict, creating conflicts of interest that distorted strategy. Orders from Batavia or Amsterdam were interpreted flexibly, sometimes intentionally, sometimes out of necessity. The result was a system where war was perpetual because it could not be waged efficiently, and yet could not be abandoned without admitting weakness. Rebellion and resistance were constant. In the Banda Islands, in the Moluccas, in Java, insurgents tested Dutch authority, exploiting gaps caused by overstretched forces. Suppressing one revolt often provoked another, creating a chain reaction that demanded more soldiers and ships. The company's reliance on coercion intensified. Violence and war were no longer exceptional, but routine, embedded into the very act of governance. European rivals observed the company's strains carefully. Opportunities arose not only for direct conflict, but for subversion, smuggling, and exploitation of Dutch inefficiency. Even successful campaigns were Pyrrhic victories, consuming capital and manpower while yielding only temporary advantage. The VOC's reputation for military might endure, but the cost of projecting that power increased steadily, threatening to outpace the profits it was meant to protect. Within Batavia, the consequences of endless warfare shaped administration. Councillors debated deployments while disease and mortality thinned their own ranks. Resources were stretched, forcing impossible choices: which fort to reinforce, which fleet to dispatch, which rebellion to suppress immediately. Mistakes were costly, and the price of miscalculation extended far beyond financial loss, affecting morale, authority, and long-term stability. By the middle of the 18th century, the VOC's war machine was self-perpetuating. Force was required to sustain control. Control was required to sustain profit, and profit was required to pay for force. The company had created a feedback loop in which each attempt to maintain authority imposed new demands, new risks, and new expenditures. Victory could not secure stability. Defeat could not easily be absorbed. The very expansion that had made the company formidable now contained within it the seeds of collapse. As the company struggled to balance the demands of commerce and coercion, the fragility of its economic model became increasingly apparent. Profits from trade were diminishing relative to the costs of enforcing the monopoly. Ships were consumed in patrols rather than commerce, garrisons in suppression rather than collection, and officers in administration rather than profit generation. The machinery of empire now consumed itself to remain upright. The next stage of decline would follow naturally from this unsustainable pattern. Trade that once fueled the empire now began to falter under the weight of its own enforcement. Prices fell, markets shifted, and the costs of monopoly outpaced revenue, revealing the first true cracks in the company's economic armor. War had preserved authority for decades, but it had done so at a cost that the empire could no longer afford indefinitely. The Dutch East India Company had long relied on the certainty of high-value commodities to sustain its global operations. Cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg from Banda, pepper from Sumatra. These spices were more than mere goods. They were instruments of power, currency in European markets, and symbols of the VOC's dominance. Yet by the mid-18th century, the foundations of this trade were weakening, not because rivals attacked the company directly, but because the system that had enforced monopoly for decades had begun to undermine its own efficiency. Supply chains became increasingly fragile. Monopolized plantations required constant oversight, yet governors and soldiers were already spread thin, consumed by endless enforcement and punitive expeditions. Crops failed, not only from weather or disease, but from labor disruption caused by coercion. Fields uprooted to prevent unauthorized trade sometimes resulted in scarcity, and scarcity threatened both local compliance and European demand. Maintaining production required more resources than the yield justified, and the margin between cost and profit began to shrink dangerously. Smuggling, once a minor annoyance, grew into a persistent drain on revenue. The very violence that maintained monopoly encouraged covert trade. Villagers, local merchants, and even company officials found ways to divert product, selling secretly to rival powers or private buyers. Enforcement was costly and imperfect. Every expedition to suppress illicit trade diverted ships and troops from profitable commerce, yet never fully eliminated the problem. Monopoly had become both the source of wealth and the reason for repeated losses. Meanwhile, European markets were shifting. Other nations were increasing their presence in Asia, and global demand for certain spices fluctuated unpredictably. The VOC's rigid focus on select commodities left it vulnerable to price swings and competition. Attempts to diversify into textiles, tea, or other goods were hampered by the same structural flaws that had long plagued the spice trade: distance, corruption, and reliance on coercion. Revenue streams that had once seemed inexhaustible were now fragile, dependent on a combination of enforcement, luck, and the continued willingness of local populations to comply under duress. The human toll of faltering trade was visible to those who remained at sea or in the colonies. Sailors and soldiers, already demoralized, faced longer voyages for diminishing returns. Crew members were dispatched to distant islands or patrolled for smugglers rather than carrying goods to market. Garrison soldiers were forced to enforce scarcity policies that further alienated local populations, creating cycles of resistance that required more manpower to suppress. Lives were sacrificed not for victory, but for maintenance of a system whose economic logic was failing. Batavia, the hub of company operations, became a center of anxiety and misreporting. Directors relied on reports that smoothed over losses, emphasizing continuity while masking decline. Clerks manipulated accounts to reflect profitability despite rising costs. Officials justified expenditures on patrols, fort repairs, and punitive expeditions as necessary to preserve monopoly, even as these activities increasingly exceeded the revenue generated by the trade itself. The appearance of success was maintained while structural decline advanced invisibly. Debt began to accumulate. To pay dividends promised to shareholders and maintain the appearance of prosperity, the VOC borrowed heavily, both internally and externally. Short-term solutions compounded long-term instability as obligations outpaced the company's ability to generate revenue. Each new loan allowed operations to continue, but also increased pressure on officials to extract more from distant colonies, intensifying cycles of violence, coercion, and exploitation. Internal inefficiency further accelerated decline. Corruption, already entrenched, undermined attempts to optimize trade. Officials enriched themselves through private deals, diverted cargo, and manipulated records, reducing both profit and accountability. Decisions that might have preserved resources were overridden by the personal calculations of those entrusted to manage them. Authority existed, but its alignment with company interest was increasingly imperfect. Rival powers exploited these weaknesses subtly. The English East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, and other Asian traders tested Dutch control in ways that did not require open conflict. Where Dutch enforcement faltered, rivals inserted themselves into trade networks, offering better terms or faster delivery. Even as the VOC maintained appearances of dominance, the company's position was steadily eroding in markets it had once controlled absolutely. For the European shareholders, decline was often invisible until it could no longer be masked. Profits that seemed stable in previous decades now fluctuated unpredictably. Dividends depended increasingly on borrowed capital, masking the deterioration of the underlying enterprise. The veneer of prosperity could only be maintained temporarily, and cracks in trust between investors and directors began to appear. The faltering trade revealed the fragility of a system built on coercion, distance, and personal enrichment. Monopoly, enforcement, and violence had preserved authority and initial profit, but they could not sustain efficiency or adaptability. Without reliable trade, the machinery of empire began to strain, revealing vulnerabilities that rivals, employees, and local populations were already exploiting. The company now faced a crisis that extended beyond manpower or resources, the collapse of confidence in the enterprise itself. As trade faltered, each voyage, each garrison, and each order became a question of whether the system could continue to function under its own weight. The next phase would expose how this faltering commerce would intersect with internal politics and mismanagement, accelerating the trajectory towards systemic collapse. As the Dutch East India Company struggled to sustain trade under mounting costs and declining returns, its system of governance faced pressures it had never been designed to withstand. The mechanisms that once maintained authority, the Council in Batavia, the Heren 18th in Amsterdam, and the intricate network of colonial administrations were strained by the combined weight of distance, corruption, and faltering commerce. Authority existed on paper, yet its execution became increasingly unreliable, revealing cracks that threatened the coherence of the entire enterprise. Decision-making became a perilous balancing act. Governors and councillors in Batavia were tasked with reconciling competing demands, maximizing profit, suppressing resistance, enforcing monopolies, and maintaining the loyalty of soldiers, sailors, and officials. Each goal required resources the company could no longer deploy reliably. Orders from Amsterdam arrived months after being issued, often misaligned with current realities. Local officials adapted these directives pragmatically, creating a patchwork of policies that sometimes conflicted with one another, undermining unity while attempting to preserve immediate control. Corruption further complicated governance. Officials used their authority to secure private gain, diverting resources from company priorities. Decisions that might have optimized trade or strengthened administration were frequently subordinated to personal enrichment. Reports sent to Europe smoothed over failures, presented successes selectively, and concealed mismanagement. By the time directors became aware of a problem, it was often too late to respond effectively. Governance became reactive rather than proactive, guided less by strategic vision than by the pressures of survival. Local populations experienced governance as unpredictability. Policies changed without warning, punishments were applied unevenly, and coercion replaced negotiation as the default tool. The line between administrative necessity and arbitrary oppression blurred, leaving communities dependent on fear and surveillance rather than cooperation or mutual interest. Resistance adapted, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, exploiting gaps in company control while enduring the risk of brutal reprisal. Governance, once intended to sustain trade, now generated cycles of defiance that consumed ever more resources. The bureaucratic machinery of the VOC struggled to reconcile financial oversight with operational control. Ledgers were manipulated to project stability, masking the increasing reliance on borrowed funds. Accounting could not capture the human costs of mortality, desertion, and disease, nor could it measure the erosion of trust that underpinned cooperation with local intermediaries. Authority depended increasingly on perception. As long as reports suggested order, directors could maintain confidence in distant holdings. Yet this perception was fragile, easily shattered by unreported rebellion, delayed shipment, or sudden disease outbreaks. Internal politics intensified these challenges. Councillors and governors vied for influence, exploiting gaps in communication to advance personal agendas. Disagreements over enforcement, trade priorities, and military deployment often slowed decision-making or produced contradictory actions. The result was a system in which coherent governance was impossible without extraordinary coordination, yet the conditions of distance and delay ensured that such coordination remained rare. Authority persisted through hierarchy and procedure rather than through shared commitment to the enterprise. For soldiers and sailors, the dysfunction of governance manifested in inconsistent orders, inadequate provisioning, and unclear objectives. Punitive expeditions were dispatched without clear goals, trade missions were delayed or rerouted based on incomplete information. Morale, already fragile, deteriorated further, contributing to desertion and passive resistance. The workforce that sustained the company's reach became less reliable, forcing administrators to rely on coercion and fear rather than engagement and competence. In Europe, directors interpreted reports through the lens of expectation rather than reality. Successes were emphasized, failures minimized, and systemic weaknesses obscured by selective reporting. Investors and politicians, dependent on dividends and trade continuity, rarely questioned the company's governance until the accumulation of errors became undeniable. By that point, mismanagement had already compounded operational and financial stress, creating a feedback loop that accelerated decline. Disease, climate, and geography magnified the fragility of governance. Batavia's tropical environment produced chronic illness among officials and troops, while storms and unpredictable currents delayed communication and supply. Attempts to enforce policy uniformly across scattered islands were rendered impractical, requiring officials to improvise within local conditions. Improvisation became necessity, yet improvisation diverged from policy, creating discrepancies that undermined central authority. By the mid-18th century, the Dutch East India Company (LES) system of governance was defined less by coordination and more by improvisation under duress. Authority persisted because of hierarchy, precedent, and force, not because of competence or legitimacy. The mechanisms designed to maintain control were now sustaining dysfunction, and the gap between appearance and reality widened steadily. The cumulative effect was a company capable of projecting power in form, but fragile in substance. Governance, once the backbone of trade and monopoly, had become a fragile scaffold, propped up by fear, debt, and perception. As trade faltered and internal inefficiencies multiplied, the VOC approached a critical threshold, the point where administration itself could no longer sustain the empire. The next phase would expose how financial mismanagement and bureaucratic inertia, combined with external pressures, would push the company closer to irreversible collapse. By the mid-18th century, the Dutch East India Company faced a crisis that no military victory, bureaucratic decree, or strict enforcement could resolve. Its finances were unraveling. For decades, the company had relied on high-value spices, monopolies, and distant colonies to generate extraordinary profits. Yet those systems, already strained by violence, corruption, and faltering trade, were now incapable of sustaining the empire's growing expenditures. Debt, once a tool to smooth operations, had become a binding chain, threatening the company's very existence. The cost of maintaining fleets, garrisons, and administrative centers had grown relentlessly. Ships were required not only for trade, but for patrols, military expeditions, and enforcement missions across the Indian Ocean. Every voyage risked loss to storms, piracy, or disease, while crew mortality eroded institutional knowledge and increased the demand for replacements. Forts and trading posts, especially in volatile regions like the Banda Islands and the Coromandel coast, required constant repair and reinforcement. The expense of projecting authority across thousands of islands outpaced the profits those territories could generate, creating an unsustainable fiscal imbalance. Borrowing became the company's primary response to this pressure. Loans were secured from wealthy investors in the Dutch Republic, from other trading companies, and even from officials within the VOC itself. These arrangements allowed the company to continue operations and maintain the appearance of solvency, but they created an escalating dependency on borrowed capital. Each debt carried interest, each repayment required new revenue, and each delay in income deepened the fiscal strain. The company's survival depended on continuous extraction from colonies already overtaxed and resistant. Revenue streams, meanwhile, were increasingly unreliable. The monopoly on spices, once a cornerstone of profitability, faltered under smuggling, crop failure, and shifting European markets. Local uprisings and foreign competition interrupted supply lines, reducing the quantity and quality of goods available for export. Even successful shipments produced diminishing returns because costs associated with enforcement, shipping, and administration had risen faster than the value of the trade. The balance between expense and income had tipped decisively against the company. Corruption exacerbated financial instability. Officials diverted goods, manipulated records, and engaged in private trade to supplement meager salaries. These actions drained revenue and undermined accountability, masking the true scale of financial distress. Directors in Amsterdam were often unaware of the full scope of losses, relying on reports filtered through layers of interested parties. By the time mismanagement was detected, corrective measures were too late or insufficient. The system itself rewarded extraction over efficiency, perpetuating the cycle of misappropriation. The pressure of debt also altered strategic decisions. Rather than allowing for flexibility or retreat, financial obligations compelled the company to maintain its empire at any cost. Territories that might have been abandoned or consolidated for efficiency were instead held through escalating expenditure. Military expeditions were launched not to generate profit, but to protect existing investments and enforce monopoly agreements. The pursuit of sustainability was sacrificed to the imperative of appearing solvent. Investors' expectations amplified these pressures. Dividends were historically high and increasingly treated as a measure of the company's health. Shortfalls were disguised by borrowing or delayed accounting, creating a dangerous illusion of stability. The VOC became trapped in a cycle of obligation. It needed profits to repay debt, debt to maintain operations, and operations to generate profits. Each link was precarious, and the failure of any one could cascade through the entire enterprise. Internal governance suffered as a consequence. Councillors and governors were forced to make decisions with fiscal survival in mind. often prioritizing immediate income over long-term planning or ethical administration. Punitive expeditions, coercive policies, and monopolistic enforcement were rationalized not only as strategic necessities but as financial imperatives. Authority was exercised with an eye to immediate gain, and investment in sustainability or reform was delayed, ignored, or impossible. For those living under the company's control, the financial collapse manifested in intensified exploitation. Villages were compelled to deliver more than previously demanded. Laborers faced harsher conditions and longer obligations. Soldiers and sailors endured unpaid or delayed wages, and officers turned increasingly to private extraction to maintain their livelihoods. The human cost of fiscal mismanagement multiplied as the empire's demands exceeded its resources. The combination of debt, declining trade, and systemic corruption created a structural fragility that could no longer be masked by appearances. The company's financial house of cards rested on borrowed capital, coerced labor, and the illusion of monopoly. Each component was unstable, and the failure of any one threatened to destabilize the entire structure. As fiscal pressure mounted, the Dutch East India Company faced a reckoning that extended beyond administration, coercion, or trade. Economic collapse, once theoretical, was becoming inevitable, setting the stage for the final unraveling of an empire that had once dominated the seas and the spice trade. The next phase would expose how these financial pressures combined with mismanagement, corruption, and declining loyalty to push the company toward irreversible decline. As the Dutch East India Company struggled to maintain its empire, the consequences of mismanagement, debt, and coercion fell hardest upon the human beings who sustained its operations. For sailors, soldiers, administrators, and local populations alike, the company's decline was not a distant abstraction in Amsterdam boardrooms. It was a daily reality of fear, disease, hunger, and relentless labor. The machinery of empire had become a machine of human suffering, and the unraveling of authority only intensified its toll. Sailors endured the harshest and most visible pressures. Voyages lengthened as trade schedules faltered, and ships were diverted for patrols or punitive expeditions. Food and fresh water were rationed more strictly, while illness spread unchecked through cramped quarters. Malaria, scurvy, and dysentery claimed lives in numbers that exceeded those lost in battle. Mutiny and desertion became increasingly common, not as acts of rebellion, but as desperate attempts to escape unendurable conditions. Those who remained were demoralized, their labor compelled by threat and necessity rather than loyalty or belief. Soldiers stationed across the company's network of forts and trading posts faced similar hardships. Assignments in remote islands exposed men to tropical diseases, malnutrition, and relentless fatigue. Military discipline was rigid, but survival was uncertain. Many died from sickness before ever seeing combat. Others deserted, seeking refuge among local communities or rival forces. Punitive campaigns against villages and uprisings added to the peril, exposing troops to ambush, disease, and overextension. Human life was expendable in service of monopoly and authority, a reality reinforced by repeated deployments and minimal concern for welfare. Administrators and clerks were not immune to these pressures. Long hours, bureaucratic complexity, and the constant threat of failure created an atmosphere of paranoia and stress. Corruption, while often lucrative, brought the risk of dismissal, prosecution, or death, particularly in volatile regions where accusations could be fatal. Decisions made under duress, whether to divert funds, conceal information, or enforce oppressive policies, exacted psychological tolls, leaving officials alienated from both their work and the people they governed. Local populations endured the heaviest and least recorded suffering. The VOC's monopolies disrupted traditional trade, agriculture, and social structures. Villages were compelled to deliver fixed quantities of spices, sometimes at the cost of their own sustenance. Fields were burned or destroyed to prevent unauthorized cultivation. Punitive raids could result in mass executions, forced relocation, or the seizure of property. Entire communities were reduced to instruments of profit, their daily existence governed by quotas, surveillance, and violence. Resistance was met with escalation, not negotiation, creating a cycle of oppression that reinforced company control while deepening resentment. Disease and famine magnified the human toll. Stagnant canals, poor sanitation, and overcrowded housing in urban centers like Batavia created environments in which illness spread rapidly. Outbreaks disrupted labor, weakened defenses, and increased mortality across all ranks of society. Even high-ranking officials were not immune. Governors and councillors succumbed to fever, often leaving their positions filled by less experienced or more corrupt replacements. The empire's human foundation was both the source of its power and the locus of its vulnerability. Psychologically, the empire was wearing thin. Fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion permeated life at sea, in forts, and within communities. Trust eroded between officials and their subordinates, between locals and administrators, and among sailors and soldiers. Cooperation, which had once been possible through incentive or mutual interest, was increasingly replaced by compliance achieved through threat. Human relationships, the glue that had enabled trade, enforcement, and governance, were corroded, leaving the company dependent on coercion as its primary tool. This widespread suffering had operational consequences. Productivity declined as laborers, soldiers, and sailors became demoralized or debilitated. Trade slowed, fortifications suffered neglect, and enforcement campaigns lost effectiveness. Even when coercion produced temporary compliance, it failed to restore the initiative, reliability, or skill that had once sustained the company. The human cost of empire was now directly undermining the company's ability to function. In Europe, these consequences were largely invisible. Investors saw profits or losses on paper, but rarely considered the lives sustaining them. Letters and reports filtered human suffering into numbers, mortality rates, desertions, and shortfalls. The people most affected by the company's decline were rarely represented in the decisions that drove it, their experience reduced to statistics or anecdotal warnings buried in archives. By this stage, it was evident that the Dutch East India Company's decline was not solely an administrative or economic problem. It was a human one. The empire had expanded and persisted through fear, coercion, and labor extraction, but those methods had reached their limits. Mortality, desertion, and resistance were no longer peripheral. They were central to the trajectory of collapse. The company's ability to enforce authority depended increasingly on human obedience, and human obedience was fading. As the VOC moved further into the 18th century, the interplay of faltering trade, administrative dysfunction, and widespread human suffering would accelerate the breakdown of its operations. The empire remained vast in territory, complex in structure, and imposing in appearance, yet the foundation, the men, women, and communities whose lives enabled its existence, was eroding from within. The next chapter would show how this erosion translated into rebellion, mismanagement, and irreversible decline across the company's holdings. By the mid-18th century, the Dutch East India Company's empire, already strained by mismanagement, debt, and human suffering, faced an additional and insurmountable pressure: widespread rebellion and resistance. What had once been sporadic uprisings became a pattern across its territories. The VOC's reliance on fear and coercion had suppressed open defiance for decades, but those methods now produced precisely the opposite of stability, creating resentment that simmered beneath the surface until it could no longer be contained. In the Banda Islands, the scars of past massacres lingered alongside an economy that remained fragile and tightly controlled. Villagers subjected to extraction and forced labor resisted through subtle defiance. Crops were sabotaged, harvests withheld, and trade diverted secretly to rivals or clandestine markets. Each act of resistance seemed minor in isolation, yet collectively they undermined the company's authority and profits. Punitive expeditions could restore compliance temporarily, but the cost in manpower, resources, and morale only deepened systemic strain. Elsewhere in the Dutch East Indies, resistance took other forms. In Java, local rulers and communities tested the limits of Dutch power, exploiting the company's stretched forces to assert autonomy or expand trade networks beyond VOC control. Ambiguity in enforcement encouraged experimentation. Where company garrisons were weak, local authorities reclaimed economic and political agency. The very presence of VOC officials, once a guarantee of order, became a focal point for negotiation, manipulation, and occasional violent confrontation. The human toll of rebellion was profound on both sides. VOC soldiers faced ambushes, raids, and protracted campaigns against populations that were intimately familiar with the terrain and climate. Casualties were frequent, illness compounded the danger, and desertion rates increased. Meanwhile, local populations suffered reprisals, displacement, and economic devastation as the company attempted to reassert dominance. Violence was cyclical. Resistance provoked suppression, suppression provoked further rebellion, and both consumed resources without producing lasting stability. Corruption within the company magnified these vulnerabilities. Officials often pursued private profit at the expense of strategic coherence, diverting resources from critical campaigns or misreporting the scale of resistance. Commands were inconsistent, garrisons were undermanned, and expeditions poorly coordinated. The administrative machinery designed to suppress rebellion now facilitated its persistence. As internal divisions allowed resistance to exploit weaknesses the company could no longer correct. European rivals watched these developments closely. Even when open warfare was absent, the erosion of VOC control presented opportunities for smuggling, trade penetration, and political influence. The company's inability to maintain reliable oversight weakened its monopoly, eroded confidence among investors, and exposed the empire to external threats that previously could have been contained. What had once seemed a disciplined and invincible maritime enterprise now appeared fragmented and vulnerable. The psychological impact on the company's workforce was equally destabilizing. Soldiers and sailors grew increasingly disillusioned as they witnessed repeated failures to suppress rebellion. Desertion rose as men sought escape from a system that demanded compliance but offered neither reward nor security. Officers, already stretched thin, faced moral and operational dilemmas. How to enforce policies effectively when human and material resources were insufficient, and how to maintain personal authority while contending with systemic dysfunction. In Batavia, reports of rebellion arrived piecemeal and often distorted. Counselors debated responses, balancing the need for swift suppression with the risk of overextension. Decisions made under pressure were sometimes contradictory, producing further confusion in the field. The perception of control persisted in Europe, but the reality on the ground revealed an empire fraying at its edges, unable to adapt to the relentless pressures of human resistance. Rebellion highlighted a fundamental truth. The VOC had relied too heavily on coercion, distance, and fear. Its authority had been maintained for decades through the projection of power, yet it had never cultivated genuine legitimacy or local cooperation. Once belief among its own personnel eroded, and once human populations refused compliance, the veneer of control shattered quickly. Resistance became both a symptom and a catalyst of collapse, exposing the fragility of an empire built on extraction and intimidation. By the close of this phase, the Dutch East India Company was no longer merely struggling against the difficulties of trade and administration. It was confronting an active erosion of authority. Rebellion in combination with financial strain, human suffering, and internal mismanagement, set the stage for the final chapters of decline. The company remained vast in scope, but its control was increasingly precarious, dependent on coercion that could no longer be sustained indefinitely. The next section would reveal how this mounting pressure accelerated both internal decay and the disintegration of the VOC's once formidable global dominance. By the middle of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company, ES Empire, had reached a critical stage where its own governance was no longer capable of sustaining the vast network of trade forts and colonies it had established. Batavia, the city once intended to embody order and authority, had become a center of dysfunction where fear, disease, and exhaustion defined daily life. Provinces across the archipelago were increasingly isolated from one another, dependent on letters that took months to arrive, and governed by officials whose priorities often conflicted with those of the company as a whole. The very structures designed to maintain control now facilitated disorder, as leadership failure spread outward from the capital to every corner of the VOC's holdings. The council in Batavia, the central administrative body, became a symbol of dysfunction. Its members were caught in endless debates over allocation of resources, enforcement of monopoly policies, and suppression of rebellions, yet they lacked the manpower or authority to implement consistent action. Disagreements were frequent, and personal ambitions often took precedence over the company's collective interest. Some councillors diverted ships and supplies for private trade. Others manipulated reports to mask mistakes. Decisions were delayed, contradictory, or implemented half-heartedly, leaving garrisons and trading posts uncertain of priorities. The result was not merely confusion, but systemic paralysis. Governors in distant provinces faced similar challenges. Their authority, already immense in theory, was increasingly meaningless in practice. With limited oversight from Batavia and scarce resources, these officials had to balance the demands of enforcing monopolies, collecting revenue, suppressing resistance, and maintaining local alliances, often with insufficient information or support. Many relied on coercion and violence to maintain authority, yet these measures produced resentment rather than stability. Punitive expeditions drained manpower and funds, and failures were frequently concealed to avoid censure from superiors in Batavia or investors in Amsterdam. The empire's governance depended on appearances, not effectiveness. Corruption compounded these problems. Officials, rewarded more for survival than competence, diverted funds, diverted trade, and manipulated records. The distinction between company interest and personal enrichment blurred as it had in previous decades, yet now it threatened the very coherence of administration. A governor might allocate ships for private profit rather than suppress rebellion, or a councillor might exaggerate trade volumes to maintain dividends. These individual acts, while often rational from a personal standpoint, collectively undermined strategic planning. Authority no longer rested on capability, but on perception, leaving the company vulnerable to mistakes that cascaded across the empire. The human impact of administrative collapse was immediate and profound. Soldiers stationed in remote forts faced shortages of food, pay, and reinforcements. Without clear directives, garrisons became demoralized, discipline weakened, and desertion increased. Sailors, already fatigued and disillusioned from long voyages, were forced to execute orders based on incomplete or contradictory instructions, heightening the risk of accidents, mutiny, or failure. Clerks and minor officials struggled to maintain accounts that no longer reflected reality, knowing that mismanagement or inaccuracy could result in punishment, yet recognizing that their own actions could not correct systemic flaws. Communication breakdown was a persistent issue. Messages from Amsterdam took months to reach Batavia, and from there, weeks or months more to reach provincial outposts. By the time instructions arrived, circumstances had often changed. Governors and officers were compelled to improvise, but improvisation was dangerous in a system that relied on rigid enforcement and perception of control. Misinterpretation of orders frequently led to conflicts with local populations, inefficient deployment of troops, and missed opportunities for trade. The machinery of empire was slowed and distorted by distance and uncertainty. Local populations, too, experienced the consequences of administrative weakness. Communities previously coerced into compliance now faced inconsistent enforcement. One garrison demanded tribute, while another overlooked obligations, creating confusion and opportunity. Villagers exploited gaps in governance to conduct illicit trade or resist company authority, knowing that oversight was delayed or absent. Punitive expeditions, when launched, were often poorly coordinated and costly, further weakening the company's capacity to maintain monopoly or authority. The impression of omnipotence was replaced by a visible, exploitable fragility. Decision-making within the company became increasingly reactive rather than strategic. Councillors and governors responded to crises as they arose, rarely able to anticipate them. Expeditions were launched to suppress revolt only after it had grown, fortifications repaired only after a breach, trade adjusted only after profits declined. Planning, foresight, and coordination, the hallmarks of an effective empire, were replaced by patchwork measures and improvisation under duress. The company's governance, once a source of strength, now accelerated decline. Financial management intertwined with administrative failure. Officials under pressure to deliver dividends and meet obligations often diverted resources for short-term gain, leaving strategic priorities underfunded. Ships that might have been used for profitable trade were assigned to reinforce garrisons or suppress rebellion, draining capital and manpower. Administrative inefficiency translated directly into economic inefficiency, reinforcing the perception that the VOC was both powerful and vulnerable simultaneously. The psychological strain on officials was immense. Governors, councillors, and clerks operated in a constant state of fear of failure, fear of disease, fear of revolt, and fear of censure from Amsterdam. These pressures encouraged risk aversion, corruption, and short-term decision-making. Even capable leaders could not sustain coherent administration under such conditions. Authority became a performance, maintained more through appearance, intimidation, and coercion than through effective governance. By the latter half of the 18th century, administrative collapse was no longer confined to isolated incidents. It had become systemic. The company could enforce compliance temporarily, punish infractions selectively, and maintain the illusion of control. Yet every decision, every deployment, and every transaction was compromised by incompetence, self-interest, or delayed communication. The empire's governance had lost its capacity to direct events. It now merely reacted to them, increasingly constrained by human, financial, and logistical limits. The consequences were far-reaching. Trade faltered, rebellions persisted, and local populations navigated the gaps in authority to their own advantage. Soldiers and sailors became unreliable, motivated by fear or self-interest rather than loyalty. Investors in Europe faced declining profits despite appearances, as borrowed capital masked the underlying instability. Administrative failure, once a minor problem, now threatened the very viability of the VOC as an empire. This stage of collapse set the conditions for the final unraveling. Governance, which had once linked every corner of the Dutch East Indies, now amplified vulnerability and inefficiency. As authority faltered, other pressures, financial, human, military, and political, intensified, pushing the company closer to irreversible decline. The empire had become a structure whose size and complexity could no longer be managed by the very system designed to sustain it. In the next chapter, The weakening monopoly and rising global competition would compound these administrative failures, ensuring that the company's decline was no longer avoidable. By the latter half of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company's monopoly, the foundation upon which its wealth and power had been built, was beginning to crumble. What had once been an almost absolute control over spices, textiles, and other exotic commodities was now undermined by both internal decay and external pressure. The company's rigid enforcement, overextended administration, and reliance on coercion had maintained authority for decades, but these same mechanisms now generated vulnerability. Competitors, once kept at bay by the VOC's formidable fleets and ruthless enforcement, sensed weakness and exploited it relentlessly. The most immediate threat came from European rivals. The English East India Company, the French Compagnie des Indes, and smaller traders from Portugal and Denmark had learned to navigate the shifting balance of power in Asia. They established networks in areas where the VOC could no longer guarantee surveillance or enforcement. Smuggling became rampant, with local merchants exploiting gaps in patrols and fortifications to move goods outside company control. Ships intercepted for illegal trade were replaced by more agile fleets, and the VOC's monopoly, which had once been enforced through fear and intimidation, now relied on increasingly tenuous coercion. The decline of monopoly was also evident in the spice trade itself. Nutmeg, cloves, and mace, commodities that had generated enormous profits, faced decreasing scarcity due to smuggling, cultivation in rival territories, and changing European demand. Plantations, previously tightly controlled through force and intimidation, were undermined by local resistance, natural disasters, and the mismanagement of administrators. Crop yields became inconsistent, and supply chains faltered as laborers resisted extraction, garrisons were undermined, and officials prioritized personal enrichment over company objectives. The scarcity that had guaranteed European prices was no longer reliable. European markets were shifting as well. Consumers increasingly sought variety and lower prices, while other nations' colonial powers expanded their presence in Asia. English merchants, in particular, developed faster, more efficient shipping routes, reducing both cost and risk. The VOC, encumbered by overextension, outdated ships, and administrative paralysis, could not compete effectively. Prices for commodities previously guaranteed by monopoly began to fluctuate. Revenue declined, yet costs of enforcement, garrisoning, and bureaucratic administration continued to rise, squeezing the company's margins and highlighting the fragility of its economic model. Internal inefficiency magnified vulnerability to global competition. Corruption, absenteeism, and inconsistent administration meant that even when resources were available, they were misallocated or delayed. Ships arrived late to ports, cargoes were miscounted or diverted, and communication between Batavia and provincial governors remained slow and unreliable. Rivals exploited these gaps, securing contracts, local alliances, and trade networks that eroded the VOC's control. By the mid-18th century, the company's monopoly was more theoretical than practical, sustained less by true authority than by the perception of dominance in regions increasingly aware of its decline. The company's attempts to preserve monopoly were increasingly destructive. Punitive campaigns against villages, confiscation of property, and coercive taxation created short-term compliance, but provoked resistance. Enforcement drained resources, weakened trade efficiency, and exacerbated administrative dysfunction. The very methods that had created monopoly, violence, surveillance, and intimidation now eroded the profitability and legitimacy of the system. Monopoly, once the source of enormous wealth, had become a burden that required constant expenditure to maintain. Human experience remained central to this decline. Sailors and soldiers were dispatched repeatedly to patrol trade routes, suppress smuggling, or enforce monopolies in regions that had long resisted Dutch authority. These missions were costly in lives and morale, further reducing operational efficiency. Local populations, witnessing the company's overreach, increasingly exploited the gaps in authority, engaging in clandestine trade or outright resistance. Even officials within the VOC, aware of the growing vulnerability, were often powerless to alter the course, constrained by debt, bureaucracy, and personal interests. The weakening monopoly also had ripple effects on European investors. Dividends, once reliably high, became inconsistent, forcing directors to borrow capital to maintain appearances. Investor confidence began to falter, prompting scrutiny of the company's management and exposing structural weaknesses. Pressure from Amsterdam amplified internal tensions, as governors and councillors struggled to deliver results in impossible conditions, sometimes resorting to deceptive reporting or short-term expedients to preserve reputation. Global competition further revealed the limits of the VOC's reliance on coercion. Whereas European rivals could operate flexibly, adapt to local conditions, and cultivate alliances with indigenous traders, the Dutch approach had become rigid. Enforcement and punishment were prioritized over negotiation and commerce. The empire had been built on fear and violence, but those methods no longer ensured dominance when rivals were willing to innovate, undercut prices, and exploit administrative inefficiency. Monopoly was no longer a tool of power. It was a liability that demanded resources without guaranteeing returns. By the late 18th century, the Dutch East India Company's empire, once vast and imposing, had entered the final stage of decline. Monopoly had weakened, rivals had penetrated trade networks, and internal inefficiency prevented effective response. The cumulative effects of corruption, rebellion, financial strain, human suffering, and overextension had left the VOC vulnerable to forces that it could no longer control. Authority persisted in appearance, but the substance of control, trade, loyalty, and revenue was slipping irretrievably. The stage was set for the final unraveling. With monopoly faltering, the company's financial and administrative structures stretched to their limits, and human labor strained beyond endurance. The empire that had dominated Asia's seas for more than a century was approaching the point at which collapse could no longer be postponed. The next chapter would document the VOC's ultimate dissolution, revealing how decades of mismanagement, overreach, and systemic fragility culminated in the end of one of history's most powerful commercial empires. By the close of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company, once the most formidable commercial enterprise in the world, had reached a point from which there was no recovery. The cumulative weight of decades of mismanagement, debt, overextension, rebellion, and human suffering had brought the empire to the brink. Territory remained vast on maps, fleets still sailed the seas, and forts still stood on strategic islands. Yet the substance of authority, the ability to trade effectively, enforce laws reliably, and sustain human labor, had vanished. What remained was an empire in form, hollowed of coherence, efficiency, and legitimacy. The final years of the VOC were dominated by attempts to maintain appearances while the structure disintegrated beneath them. Ships were dispatched on voyages increasingly unprofitable or redundant. Garrisons were maintained in distant islands with dwindling manpower, and officials attempted to enforce monopolies that no longer held practical power. Administrators in Batavia scrambled to respond to crises with inadequate resources, balancing the need to suppress rebellion, meet obligations to shareholders, and manage internal dissent. Each decision, made under duress and often corrupted by self-interest, only delayed the inevitable. Debt, the silent architect of collapse, reached unsustainable proportions. Loans taken to maintain operations, pay dividends, and reinforce authority could no longer be serviced through trade alone. Interest accumulated, repayments were postponed, and investor confidence eroded. European shareholders, once dazzled by the VOC's profits, now faced mounting losses. Attempts to restructure finances were impeded by the very bureaucratic and administrative weaknesses that had enabled corruption and inefficiency for decades. The empire's wealth existed largely on paper. Its real resources were overstretched and exhausted. Externally, the VOC faced challenges that it could no longer counter. English, French, and Portuguese traders, alongside increasingly assertive local powers, penetrated former monopolies, secured their own alliances, and captured markets that had once been Dutch. The empire's inability to respond decisively to competition reflected the combined impact of administrative paralysis, financial weakness, and faltering human commitment. The once mighty fleets of the VOC were now insufficient to patrol every trade route or defend every garrison, and the company's coercive power could no longer ensure compliance or deter rivals. Human suffering, always an underlying factor, intensified in the final decades. Sailors and soldiers continued to face extreme conditions with minimal compensation or recognition. Administrators navigated impossible expectations and impossible timelines, while local populations bore the brunt of punitive enforcement, taxation, and coerced labor. Desertion, disease, and rebellion became regular occurrences, undermining authority and further draining resources. The very individuals who had sustained the company for generations were now either dead, fleeing, or indifferent to its directives. In 1796, the company's formal dissolution was set in motion by the Batavian Republic, reflecting the reality that the VOC no longer functioned as a sovereign or economic force. By 1799, the company was officially disbanded, its debts assumed by the state, its territories absorbed into a new administrative structure, and its monopoly over trade extinguished. The legacy of centuries of empire remained. Forts, plantations, and settlements continued to shape regional geopolitics, but the company itself, once capable of shaping continents and commanding the seas, was gone. The collapse was not a sudden catastrophe, but the inevitable consequence of decades of accumulated failures. Mismanagement, corruption, and overextension had weakened the system. Endless warfare, declining trade, and faltering monopoly had drained resources. Rebellion, desertion, and disease had eroded human capacity. Financial dependence on borrowed capital had compounded every difficulty, making recovery impossible. The VOC's demise illustrates the limits of empire built on coercion and extraction, where appearance and perception are insufficient to sustain real power indefinitely. The human dimension of collapse is as important as the economic or political. Communities that had endured forced cultivation, violent suppression, and economic exploitation survived to rebuild on their own terms. Sailors and soldiers returned to civilian life or perished in distant lands. Administrators left a trail of records that reveal the contradictions of loyalty, ambition, and desperation within an empire that was no longer coherent. The VOC's human legacy is embedded in both the suffering it caused and the resilience of those who endured it. In the broader scope of history, the VOC's collapse reshaped the dynamics of global trade and colonial power. Its territories passed into new hands, and its methods, both brilliant and brutal, served as cautionary examples for future enterprises. The rise and fall of the Dutch East India Company demonstrate that control over wealth, territory, and force is not enough to sustain power indefinitely. Without effective governance, reliable human labor, financial prudence, and adaptability to competition, even the mightiest of empires is vulnerable to decline. The end of the VOC stands as a testament to the interconnectedness of commerce, human experience, and governance. It reminds us that empires are not merely maps or ledgers. They are networks of people, each dependent on the other for survival, success, and stability. When trust, loyalty, and competence are eroded, no amount of wealth, firepower, or ambition can preserve authority. The Dutch East India Company, once dominant across oceans and continents, was ultimately undone by the cumulative weight of these human, economic, and administrative failures, a collapse both inevitable and instructive for the centuries that followed.